I found Alex sitting on the edge of his bed this morning, like a man at a starting line who forgot what race he signed up for, staring at a phone that somehow contains the entire weight of the world and the snack section of the grocery store. He looked simultaneously determined and resigned, which is an impressive emotional combo I only usually see in reality: TV contestants and cats who think about opening doors. I threw him a look that said, "Buddy, we have 5 minutes before your coffee goes cold and the procrastination monster gets fed." And yes, I did wink like a used car commercial host. He shrugged, which in Alex language means, "Watch me perform a masterpiece of delays," so naturally I cued the pep talk music in my head, and we began. When he finally opened his notes app, it looked less like a to-do list and more like the aftermath of a confetti cannon aimed at everything I'll do someday, which is a very specific aesthetic choice and one Alex is somehow proud of. I explained, in my most patient narrator voice, that the mountain of tasks doesn't become smaller by rooting for it, and also, I promised I wasn't trying to be mean, just effective. He chewed his lip, which in Alex parlance means there's a plan forming that's approximately 60% brilliance and 40% maybe I should take a naps. I told him we were going to try a few mental rules that are short, actionable, and kind to his ego, no medieval discipline required. I told Alex something that feels a bit like heresy in motivational posters. Motivation is a guest that visits when it pleases, but rules are the landlord who pays the bills. We need rules. He raised an eyebrow as if to ask whether rules would require helmets and whistles, so I clarified, mental rules, like tiny signposts that push you into action without demanding inspirational fireworks. He liked the idea of being pushed gently, since his idea of a hard push is moving the couch an inch to find the remote. I promised he'd be surprised how a handful of simple mental rules can turn the "I'll do it later" loop into "done, nice, celebrate." Before we dove into specifics, I made Alex promise, dramatically, like a pirate switching captains, to try the rules for 1 week and not to bail on me before the first victory dance. He pretended to shake his hand on it, but then asked if snacks were an acceptable bribe, which, I admitted, is an effective cognitive perk, so yes, snacks allowed under the tiny rewards clause. He beamed like a man who had just negotiated better terms with life. I told him the first rule involves 5 minutes, a timer, and absolute permission to fail gloriously. He nodded, and we both secretly hoped this would stick longer than his last gym phase. I told Alex to pick one task and set a 5-minute timer, and he looked at me like I suggested he climb Everest in flip-flops, which is fair. He does dramatic interpretations of simple instructions. He argued, half joking, that 5 minutes isn't real work, but I reminded him that starting is 90% defeat for procrastination and that 5 minutes is a legal-sized doorway to momentum. So he set the timer, breath held like a contestant on a game show, and I whispered to him and the universe, "Do the thing, tiny human." He began, slightly awkward at first, fingers fumbling, as if relearning a handshake with productivity. A funny thing happened. The timer ticked, Alex's shoulders relaxed, and the task stopped looking like a mythical beast and started looking like a loaf of bread, realistic and sliceable. He found a rhythm, his pencil moving with a focus that made his previous procrastination look almost like a costume he used at parties, and we both felt that small, sweet jolt of progress. I reminded him that the goal was 5 minutes, not perfection, and that sometimes the 5-minute trick generously becomes 20 because momentum is a generous bully. He grinned like someone who discovered matching socks in laundry, unexpected but delightful. I gave Alex permission to stop once the timer dinged, because part of the trick is removing the guilt about quitting early and letting tiny wins exist on their own terms, which he appreciated like a kid who legally gets to eat dessert first. He actually stopped at 5 minutes, looked around with the proud bewilderment of someone who hadn't moved forward in months, and realized, oh, that wasn't so bad. I made him celebrate with a tiny fist pump, which is now apparently his signature move for micro-wins, and it was adorable in a way that made the room feel like a low-budget awards show. We made a note. Repetition beats drama. 5 minutes, often, consistently, is the slow cooker of progress. We talked about how the 5-minute rule works because it short-circuits the "I'll start after I feel ready" trap, replacing it with a tiny, low-friction action that can be repeated until it becomes a habit rather than a Herculean feat. Alex tried it on something small, clearing his email inbox of spam, and came back 20 minutes later with a smugness usually reserved for puzzle champions, proving my point with alarming eloquence. I told him to mentally file that smugness away as evidence that rules can create momentum even when feelings are absent, and he nodded like a man who just found a cheat code. Then we high-fived because apparently 5-minute wins are now ceremonious enough to require applause. Next, I taught Alex the if-then nudge, a tiny conditional sentence that turns vague intentions into specific actions, kind of like giving your future self a clear map instead of a shrugging mentor. He giggled when I used the word nudge like it was a tiny magical elbow from the universe, and then immediately wrote a few if-then lines down as if composing a secret spell. I explained that the magic here is in specificity. If it's 9, then I'll write 200 words is better than I'll write later because it removes guesswork and decision friction. Alex loved the idea because it felt like outsourcing willpower to a trustworthy robot. We brainstormed absurdly specific if-then rules tailored to Alex's life, like, if I open my laptop after lunch, then I will type one sentence before checking anything else. He grinned, like someone who'd been given permission to be imperfect but productive. He added one that made me laugh. If I find myself doom-scrolling, then I will stand up and make a cup of tea, which, honestly, is peak self-care disguised as productivity. The key was keeping the bar low enough that the action is irresistible, and he wrote them in big letters, like a list of tiny commandments he could live by. He felt empowered, as if he'd installed new software in his brain labeled Do Stuff 2.0. I reminded Alex that willpower is a limited resource and that if-then nudges are a brilliant hack to make choices automatic without draining your emotional bank account, which in his case is usually underfunded by 3 p.m. He rolled his eyes, but in a cute, conspiratorial way, because he knows he's not a superhero at resisting distractions. He's just a guy with a phone and several hibernating concentration cells. We set a few nudges for his next work session and half-expected chaos, but instead, the nudges quietly guided him like invisible traffic cones on his mental highway. He made it through the session and rewarded himself with a victory snack that looked suspiciously like a cookie wearing sunglasses. We discussed whether to make these nudges public, telling a friend or writing them on a board, and Alex flirted with the idea of broadcasting his if-then rules like a tiny reality show, which I vetoed in the name of privacy and less commentary. Instead, he tried a half measure, sharing one small rule with his roommate, which added a gentle accountability without making him feel like he was auditioning for applause. The roommate promptly sent a supportive thumbs-up emoji, which Alex interpreted as both cheerleading and a subtle threat, but it worked. He followed through. I told him the moral is simple, accountability is useful, but pick your audience wisely unless you actually want a live studio audience. Alex had a monster-sized project on his list. The kind of thing that lives in your brain, rent-free, and grows fangs when you look at it, and he confessed that its sheer size had turned him into a professional avoidance artist. I told him, we don't fight monsters head-on. We give them tiny tasks and starve them of their drama, which is less cinematic but significantly more effective. he made a face like someone who wanted his monster to at least have a name and a backstory, and I suggested Mr. Deadline because it sounded villainous and mildly caffeinated. Then we started slicing the project into bite-sized steps, so small that even a sleepy squirrel could chew them. I asked Alex to turn the monster into micro-tasks, each actionable and under 15 minutes, and he dutifully wrote things like open documents, draft 2 sentences, and highlight key points, which is gloriously unsexy and brilliantly effective. He admitted that watching a list of bite-sized wins accumulate was unexpectedly addictive, and I noted that the brain treats each checkmark like a tiny dopamine gift, which no one should shame you for enjoying. He started doing 5-minute rounds on the project and came back with legitimately impressive chunks of progress that looked suspiciously like actual work. I reminded him kindness and structure beat willpower in the long run, which he nodded to while balancing a tiny stack of completed sticky notes like trophies. We talked about using constraints as allies, deadlines, tiny quotas, or artificial limits that make tasks feel finite and therefore manageable. And Alex loved the idea because rules are a comfortable jacket for his anxious brain. He set a 10-minute timer to research a topic and, to his surprise, emerged with 3 useful bullet points and a triumphant smile that suggested he'd discovered a hidden room in his own house. I pointed out that constraints create urgency without panic, like a friendly nudge rather than a shove off a cliff. He agreed to keep experimenting because success, even scaled down, is very habit-forming in the best way. I made Alex promise to celebrate tiny progress because checking off microtasks is basically emotional housekeeping and deserves acknowledgement, and he obliged with the solemnity of someone who takes snack breaks very seriously. He rewarded himself with a tiny dance which, frankly, was both adorable and necessary for mental hygiene, and we documented it as evidence that small wins compound into big confidence. I told him that the project would shrink if he keeps feeding it consistent micro-effort rather than dramatic bouts of heroism followed by guilt, which sounded like a good life choice to both of us. He nodded and rearranged his tiny trophy stack of sticky notes, looking like a king of efficiently managed chaos. I explained to Alex that defaults are the unsung heroes of productivity. Set the right ones and you reduce daily friction, which he liked because friction is something he reserves for trying to open stubborn jars. He swapped a 3-click path into his most productive app for a 1-click desktop shortcut and acted like he had invented gravity, which is probably exactly how most good inventions are celebrated. We laughed about how small changes compound. A 2-second improvement repeated 100 times becomes a small time machine. Alex loved the idea of making good choices easier because lazy efficiency is still efficiency. We rearranged his workspace so the things he needs for focus are in arm's reach and distractions are politely farther away, which made him grumble about feng shui and then immediately appreciate the serenity of a tidy desk. He moved his phone to a different room during focus blocks and gasped as if he'd witnessed a minor miracle, quiet, calm, and suspiciously productive, which confirmed that proximity is basically temptation's secret weapon. I told him to treat his environment like a well-designed app, default to usefulness, not to chaos. He nodded solemnly, taking in the newly optimized zone as if it were a meditation retreat with better lighting. I nudged Alex to automate tiny recurring tasks like email filters, calendar blocks, or auto payments, because each automation is a tiny rebellion against unnecessary decision-making and also very satisfying in a geeky way. He set up a few filters and instantly felt like a wizard who had taught his inbox a few manners, which is the right emotional response to a well-organized digital life. We laughed as he named one filter Inbox Bouncer because he enjoys a good pun and the idea of digital security with attitude. The moral was clear: automations are like pipelines for your future sanity. We also created default responses for when Alex hits that weird slump where everything feels heavy. Plan A is work, Plan B is micro-movement like a walk, and Plan C is immediate restoration like a power nap, because sometimes life hands you soggy willpower and you need contingency. He liked having a hierarchy of acceptable options because it made choices feel less like moral failures and more like pragmatic triage. I told him to write these defaults somewhere visible so his future brain can read them like a menu, and he promised to make it look pretty, which I admired deeply. He scheduled the defaults into his day and felt a little more resilient immediately, like a person wearing a practical cape. I taught Alex that rewards should come right after the action to reinforce the behavior, because delayed celebrations are emotionally like a promised party that never happens, and that is a tragedy nobody should endure. He started small, a good snack, a 5-minute dance, or 10 minutes of scrolling guilt-free, and discovered that immediate tiny rewards make future effort feel more likely and less like punishment. He gave himself a cheat cookie after finishing a tough chunk, which he ate like a philosopher tasting the meaning of victory, and it worked wonders for his morale. I told him to choose rewards that don't sabotage the next action, because cookies are lovely, but they shouldn't lead to a sugar coma. We set up a visible tracking system, a simple chart, or a jar for marbles, so Alex could see progress accumulating in a way that felt concrete and slightly game-like, because who doesn't enjoy a game with pleasant visuals and no boss battle? He loved the physicality of dropping a marble into a jar and watching the pile grow, which made his progress feel tangible rather than abstract and shameful. I told him that visual proof is a powerful ally for maintaining momentum because the brain loves patterns it can see. He started a small ritual: marbles in for wins, tiny celebratory whoop, repeat, which made our apartment sound suspiciously cheerful. We designed rewards that feel like genuine treats without creating regret or solving one problem by creating another. For instance, a brisk walk, a favorite podcast episode, or a tiny creative sketch, which Alex favored because it doesn't require gluten-free diplomacy. He learned to avoid counterproductive rewards like, "I'll binge a whole season if I finish this," because binges tend to erase momentum rather than reinforce it. He experimented and found that small, creative joys and micro-adventures boosted his energy more sustainably than passive consumption, which surprised him in a good way. I reminded him that the best rewards build more of the behavior you want, not less. We talked about sharing small wins with a friend or in a group to amplify the joy without turning it into performance anxiety, and Alex tried sending a quick victory message to a buddy, which came back with celebratory emojis and sincere encouragement. The social nudge made the little win feel larger, like a tiny echo that grows into a reassuring chorus, and Alex loved the communal feel without needing a podium. I cautioned him to pick supportive folks who actually celebrate rather than people who subtract joy by critiquing details, which is an unfortunate specialty of some well-meaning friends. He curated a small cheer squad, and suddenly his wins had a cheering section, which is extra motivation and frankly adorable. We chose one project as the rescue mission, just one, because alpha decisions are emotionally expensive, and Alex keeps his energy conserved for dramatic gestures and coffee, which is his preferred fuel. He narrowed the project down to a single, annoying but important thing, and I reminded him that mastering one habit creates confidence that migrates to other areas like a friendly colony. He felt relief at the narrow focus and wrote a micro plan that included a 5-minute warm-up, 3 if-then nudges, and a rewards list that didn't involve sugar vats. I admired his practical bravery. It's one thing to plan theoretically and another to commit to a single, defensible micro-action. We arranged the micro-tasks into a tiny sequence so Alex wouldn't have to invent the next step in the middle of the work, because indecision is a strategic procrastinator's best friend, and Alex has seen it at work far too often. He wrote the first 3 actions on big sticky notes and placed them where he could see them, creating a simple roadmap that eliminates the "now what?" freeze. He liked the clarity so much that he drew little arrows between steps like a child making an adventure map, which I secretly adored because it meant the plan felt playful, not punitive. He promised to follow the sequence for 3 sessions, which is an optimistic but sensible pilot test. We blocked time in his calendar for micro-sessions because unscheduled time is a temptation incubator, and Alex prefers his temptations contained and labeled. He added recurring blocks with descriptive titles like Write, 10-minute and Research, 15-minute and Pretended to be an Executive, which is a great rehearsal for actually acting like one. The calendar looked oddly beautiful and courageous, like a tiny fortress of intention, and he felt proud enough to take a selfie with it, which I gently teased him about and then liked the photo because solidarity. The routine began to feel less like strict discipline and more like an agreeable appointment with himself. We tried the plan, observed what felt awkward, and adjusted it, because planning without feedback is like baking without tasting, occasionally edible, often disappointing. Alex noticed that mornings were better for creative work than afternoons, so we shifted a few blocks, and he legitimately marveled at how much more flow he had when the timing fit his natural rhythm. He treated the first week as a friendly experiment, taking notes like a scientist with a slightly crooked lab coat, and the results were encouraging: less dread, more actual output, and a healthier relationship with the word start. I told him to be patient and iterative. Improvements add up in surprisingly fast ways when you're consistently kind to your future self. I challenged Alex to follow the rules for 7 days straight. 5-minute starts, if-then nudges, micro-tasks, smart defaults, and immediate rewards, which he accepted with a mixture of bravado and quiet terror that I found charming. We documented the rules on a single sheet and put it where he'd trip over it emotionally every morning, which sounds dramatic, but is just called practical reinforcement. He asked if I would be his accountability narrator, to which I replied with a wink and a stern-sounding yes, but gentle, because supportive nagging is an art form I practice. He smiled, packed his tiny plan, and we began the experiment like 2 people covertly rooting for a houseplant to thrive. We checked in each day with tiny reflections: what worked, what didn't, and what felt surprisingly better than expected, and Alex recorded them like a captain noting weather on a calm sea of productivity. By day 3, the 5-minute start had changed from a dare to a ritual. By day 5, his micro-tasks had accumulated into real progress. By day 7, he had a real, tangible accomplishment with both a finish line and leftover energy. He was proud in a way that was not loud, but deeply satisfying, which is my favorite kind of pride because it doesn't require balloons. I reminded him that compound consistency beats dramatic effort, and he nodded as if a weight had been moved from his shoulders. We also talked about relapses, because of course they happen. Alex had at least one day of spectacularly creative avoidance where he reorganized his sock drawer into a color-coded masterpiece, but we treated that as data, not defeat. I reassured him that a missed day doesn't erase prior progress. It just informs the plan. Maybe he needed more realistic pacing, a better reward, or a tweaked default. He adjusted and kept going, showing the kind of resilience that quietly outperforms heroics over time. I applauded him for returning after the stumble because that's the whole point: consistency over perfection. At the end of the week, Alex felt different in a good way. Less dread, more evidence, and a few new habits that made starting easier than ever before, which is practically a miracle for a man of his charmingly variable focus. We built a maintenance plan, Keep rules simple, rotate rewards, and review progress weekly so the system doesn't calcify into something rigid and joyless. He promised to keep experimenting because he's the kind of person who enjoys a challenge with snacks and incremental wins, and I promised to be there narrating in my terribly supportive way. We high-fived, documented the victory, and he declared himself a committed 5-minute convert, which may be the kind of identity upgrade that'll stick. Let's recap. 5-minute starts, if-then nudges, microtasks, smart defaults, and immediate rewards. A toolkit designed to make starting less dramatic and much more likely to happen, especially if you prefer subtle strategy over motivational fireworks. I reminded Alex and you that these rules are small, flexible, and kind, meant to help, not to shame, and that's the whole point. He admitted in a whisper that he had been terrified of beginning, which we both laughed at because fear and humor make an odd but effective pair. I encouraged you to try one rule today, just one, and report back like you're sending a postcard from the frontier of your own achievements. In a moment of pure honesty, Alex confessed that the hardest part wasn't the rules themselves, but allowing himself to be imperfect while trying them, which is a courage move that deserves more applause than it gets. He said he felt lighter having a structure that doesn't punish slip-ups but turns them into data, and he thanked me in a way that made me feel proud and slightly smug as his narrator, which I will admit I enjoyed. I reminded him, and you, that trying is the real win, and that success often hides in tiny consistent steps, not spectacular leaps. He nodded, admitted to hiding one last cookie, and then offered me a bite as a final symbolic truce with procrastination. Here's your micro-challenge. Choose one task, set a 5-minute timer right now, and use one if-then nudge to follow through. Treat yourself to a tiny reward if you do it, and write down one sentence about how it felt afterward. I promise it's not dramatic, it's not expensive, and it doesn't require you to love mornings, just a single small act of momentum. Alex is doing it too, currently doing a ridiculous little victory dance in the corner. Feel free to join in or at least mentally high-five him. Then come back tomorrow and try another tiny rule. Consistency is quietly thrilling when you give it a chance. I'll wrap up by saying the rules work because they're humane. They respect your limits, remove friction, and make starting easier without turning life into a regimented boot camp, which Alex appreciates because he likes soft socks and modest triumphs. If you'd like, come back to these rules anytime. They're a toolkit, not a commandment, and remember, progress is usually a long, steady trudge rather than a single leap. Alex and I will be here, possibly with snacks, and definitely with more tiny experiments, ready to cheer you on the next time you need a nudge. Go set that 5-minute timer. I'll wait and serenade your first sentence with imaginary confetti.